Hello learners, I am Dr. Subodh Kesharwani, working with Indira Gandhi National Open University in School of Management as an associate professor capacity. The topic which I am going to talk today is quite important because it's purely based on the assumptions. And when you are assuming anything, when you are creating a hypothetical format and then you run on this particular format, I think that is a very challenging task. So hypothesis is a very important ingredient as far as research is concerned, as far as the day-to-day life is concerned. But anyway, we are just concentrating ourselves to this particular format called research, and we have observed that in research hypothesis is a very important thing, because as I have talked about, it based on the assumptions. It talks about the hypothetical things, and on the basis of the assumption you proceed, and further what happen, the things are going to be changed. So anyway, prior to going into the depth of this particular topic, I just want to throw a light that this is part of our course called MCU3, Research Methodology and Statistical Analysis. We are in the first block, which talks about research and data collection. In the second block talks about processing and preservation of data. Then you have block 3, relational and trend analysis. And the fourth block talks about probability and hypothesis testing, I think. And finally, the interpretation report writing is there. But anyway, so we are just building a concept of hypothesis in this particular presentation. And when we are move to the block 4, after having 20-30 rounds of discussions, then we will definitely throw a light on how we are going to test the hypothesis. What are the certain parameters, what are the certain tests which are going to be quite important, because when you are presuming anything, you have certain options behind it. So in hypothesis, what we observe, that there are null hypotheses, there are alternate hypotheses. So we are going to throw a light on all those aspects, and we start with the assumptions. Then that assumption fails, and then alternate hypothesis comes into picture. So how this process comes, what is the modus operandi behind it, we will definitely talk about all those aspects. Just recapitulate what we have done in our preceding lectures. We start with the research preamble part of research, where the basic concept had been talked about, how the research is going to be initiated. Then research thoughts are there. Then there are certain FAQs, frequently asked questions, which are quite omnipresent in nature and comes in the mind of researchers when they are just entering into the world of research. So what we have observed that these are the things which we have already covered, and we have built the concept now, and gradually we are just throwing a light on certain terminologies, and once we accomplish all those terminologies, then we start execute it. So we start with building the concept, then evaluate the process, and then finally start implementing and then executing the process. So this whole course talks about the complete reckoner kind of, which starts with research methodology and statistical analysis are used in between. So anyway, research plan and research problem we have already talked about, how you're going to plan your research and what are the problems which comes in between and work as a stumbling blocks, and how you're going to come out, because if your planning is good, if you have a long-term vision, very easily you can narrow down that stumbling blocks, that problem, and finally you reach to the conclusion. So this is all about and once you have got a knack of research methodology or the research, very easily you can use it once you go for the further research, when you go for your doctoral programs or the future studies. And finally, the formulation of objective was there. We have seen that objective is very important ingredient. In our preceding lectures, we have thrown a very, very dedicatedly about this terminologies, about the objectives, and we see that how the gaps are converted into objectives, and how objectives are, helps in building the hypothesis. So today discussion talks about, how we are going to talk about the hypothesis and how these objectives are converted into hypothesis, and then these hypotheses are, used in as a null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. So based on the the respondents, how the respondents are going to reciprocate, and this is the model which is there. So anyway, I think we start with a theory of hypothesis, and there is a big difference between hypothesis and theory. And if we see that the hypothesis talks about the scientific reasoning, is an assumption made before any research has been completed for the sake of testing. So I think we assume, assumptions may be sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but what we observe that it's all depends how you are presuming the things, how you are assuming the things. Whereas, when you talk about the theory, a theory on the other hand is a principle set to explain phenomena already supported by a data. So I think theory is more concrete in nature, and when you compare with hypothesis is based on assumptions, whereas theory is based on, the the data which is more genuine in nature. So there are building blocks. We start with hypothesis, then develop a format, then develop a theory. So there's a difference between hypothesis and theory, and hypothesis is a proposed explanation for some phenomena based on limited evidence, whereas theory is an idea or set of ideas that is intended to explain facts or events. So it's not scientifically tested or proven. Scientifically tested and proven if you talk about the theory, and hypothesis is not, because it's on the process of testing. So sometimes the whatever the phenomena, whatever the this hypothesis you have taken, maybe it become accepted, it's rejected. So we will talk about all those things, about the acceptance and rejections in a very gradual manner. We will take certain examples. There are some real life scenarios. There are certain examples which can definitely defend how the hypothesis is going to be changed and what are the types of hypothesis. That is more important, because this is a presentation which talks about how you're going to build that concept of hypothesis. Once you are acclimatized yourself, once you are acquainted with the hypothesis phenomena, I think that is where you can very easily initiate your research, because the backbone of any research is the hypothesis. And the choosing the good objective, we have already talked about that. If your gap is explored and then you have chosen an objective which could be not more but could be fingertips, and from there if you have framed the hypothesis, and if that hypothesis are well versed, and then you have taken alternative hypothesis, then you have accepted or rejection model is there. So we will definitely talk about all those things. Then based on limited data, that is very true, because when you talk about the hypothesis, you have got certain constraints, certain limitations is there, and based on wide range of data. I think theory is always believes in having a wide range of data, and can lead to a theory, can be formulated through a hypothesis. That is very true, because if you talk about hypothesis, there are certain the secondary data which are there. There are certain the literature which is there, and when you go through that particular literature, from there you find out certain gaps. So while talking about the hypothesis, you have to have certain theory in your mind or theory in your hand, and from that theory you extract certain information, then come to the certain hypothesis. And when you talk about the theory, it can be formulated through an hypothesis. That is very true, because when you apply the phenomena, when you apply the tools of hypothesis, you have null hypothesis, then you have certain alternate hypothesis, then you accept or reject, and finally when you accept it, it's become part and parcel of the research. And when you start doing the research, then very easily you come to the conclusion, and that take a form of the theory. So this is that considered to be the first hand information which you gathered or taken, extracted from the respondents to whom you have floated the questionnaires. So this is something which is there. And when you talk about hypothesis is a statement to guide research. That is very true. And when you talk about prediction is a guess of the outcome. So the example is that getting 8 hours of sleep makes more productive employees. That is very true. It's considered to be a hypothesis. But on the other hand, prediction is if the individual gets 8 hours of sleep, then the individual will be more productive. I think because it talks about the thing which is there. So a hypothesis can be defined as an explanatory principle accounting for known facts. In hypothetical thinking, we want to know why something is true, and we reason backward to find some explanation for the facts, one that makes sense of them. So we use our imagination to find some reasons why things are the way they are, and then these are considered to be a null hypothesis. And then finally what happened, we take alternative hypothesis, and then we start doing the research, and finally the respondents the questionnaire need to be sent, and then whatever they reciprocates, we try to record it, and then the sample which you have chosen and those who have reciprocated, we accumulate all those data and then come to the conclusion. So this is the modus operandi, and once we build the concept, gradually there are certain more terminologies which we throw a light on that, and finally what happened, after certain time you find out that when the concept is going to be mug up, then very easily you can start using it. You start testing the concepts and then come to the conclusion. So that is the beauty of this particular course. If you talk about research methodology and statistical analysis, it talks about the research from underneath to pinnacle, and what we observe that there are many things which are taken into consideration, and while certain concepts, certain approaches, so we will definitely throw a light, and you feel that once you are acquainted with this particular course, very easily you can do your research in a more systematic manner. So this is the point of discussion for today's discussion. We have already talked about the research problem. This is a chapter 2, and formulation of objective we have covered in our preceding sessions. And this particular portion we are covering, hypothesis, meaning of hypothesis, types of hypothesis, very important, like descriptive or explanatory or null or alternative. So we will talk about what are the different types of hypothesis, and we will gradually take certain examples. That is more important, like how these examples are defending this particular type. So that is where it can give the clear picture about the certain things. And then testing of hypothesis and use of hypothesis, how you're going to use the hypothesis, because if you are not in a position to use the hypothesis, you are not going to get the end results. So for getting the end results, for getting the respondent's view, I think this hypothesis is quite important. So hypothesis in research is talking about testable answers to a scientific questions, and which are more tentative in nature. And hypothesis proposed explanation for a phenomena. That is very true. It's not a solid verdict, but it's a proposed, and maybe whatever we are proposing can be accepted, can be rejected. So we will see that how this procedure can work. And hypothesis suggested solution for an unexplained occurrence that does not fit into current accepted scientific theory. And what we observe that an hypothesis leads to one or more predictions. It's not like that you have only one predictions or two predictions. You have one or more predictions. So that is the reason when we work on the basis of gap and come to the objectives, these objectives are converted into hypothesis. And when you are having the hypothesis, you have 2 or 3 verdicts in between. One talks about it can happen, it cannot be happen. So on the basis of these things, your predictions can somewhat accepted sometimes, sometimes it could be rejected. So the basic idea of a hypothesis is that there is no predetermined outcome. That is very true, because if you have a predetermined outcome in your mind, I think you could be biased. And sometimes we have observed that the researchers are quite rigid in nature. What they are thinking, that whatever the hypothesis they have taken, the null hypothesis they have taken, it considered to be accepted. So they are quite biased in their beginning stage. So the good point one should keep in mind that they should not be predetermined, and let the respondents reciprocate, because it's fine that you have gone through the literature, you are expert in your particular area, you are wizard in your particular area. But when you are floating this particular hypothesis or questions among the masses, among the big number of people, I think when they reciprocate, when they reply, then the real challenge comes, because the individual perception differs from the opinion of the lot of people opinions. So when lot of people reply, they are taking into consideration certain minds, and sometimes in majority of cases what we observe that the null hypothesis, the predictions or the opinion which we have taken in the very beginning seems to be rejected. So yeah, it's a part of the life which is going on. So that could be the methodology which we are going on. So for a hypothesis to be scientific hypothesis, the scientific methods requires that one can test it, and we will definitely talk about when we are starting testing the hypothesis. We try to take some more examples which can defend the certain questions which comes in the mind of the researchers or the grassroots researchers who have just initiated their research. So scientists generally base scientific hypotheses on previous observations that cannot satisfactorily be explained with the available scientific theories. And what is hypothesis in research? Hypothesis is a special statement of prediction. I have already thrown a light. It describes in concrete rather than theoretical. So terms what you expect will happen in your study, and not all studies have hypothesis. That is very true. Sometimes there are certain things which goes in a stereotype manner, which goes in a straightforward manner. So there the hypothesis is not going to apply, and if there could not be no alternatives, I think in that case we have to follow whatever the null hypothesis we have taken. And sometimes the study is designed to be exploratory and inductive research is there. So hypothesis is used in an experiment to define the relationship between two variables. There are one variables which talks about one thing and other variables talks about that. So we will definitely talk about what are the variables and how this relationship is going to be done between bridge between the two variables. The purpose of hypothesis is to find the answers to a question, and that is very true. There, when we have certain hypothesis, null hypothesis, and once we start, doing the research, the alternate hypothesis also comes. So it is going to the questions which researchers had framed, it's going to come to them. The independent variable in our previous example is not studying for a test, and the dependent variable that you are using to measure outcome is your test score. So what we have seen, that hypothesis should always explain what you expect to happen, be clear and understandable, be testable, and be measurable. I think that is something which is there. It's not like that you should always, expect the things in a very simple manner. Always believes in test. There are certain tests which are there, and there are certain statistical tool also, like t-test, ANOVA test and all. So how these are going to, test the hypothesis, and there are certain, the manual way of checking the hypothesis. But when the data is gigantic in nature, when the data is different shape, I think the statistical test is going to play a very vital role. And how you're going to measure that is more important. So contain an independent and dependent variable. There are independent variable, there are dependent variable, and how it is going to have a combination of that need to be taken care. So now this is very important thing, because when we talk about the hypothesis, I think there are certain types which need to be highlighted in a more elaborative manner. So explanatory hypotheses are there, then descriptive hypotheses are there, then analogical hypotheses are there, then working hypotheses are there, then null hypothesis and alternate hypotheses are there, then statistical hypotheses are there. So when we are going to use this hypothesis, it's there. There is no thumb rule behind that. It's not like that, and there is no rocket science that you can start with one hypothesis and you are adhere or rigid to that. Very easily you can switch over yourself. Very easily you can move into based on the circumstances, based on the scenario, and sometimes the based on the sample size also. Sometimes what you observe that the sample size. Sampling, collecting the sample, collection of data through sampling is, it's a very cumbersome task. So in that case, there are certain, the methodology which are going to apply. So we will talk one by one. If you talk about, the explanatory hypothesis, which is usually called the relational hypothesis, it describes relationship between two variables, and relationship may be positive, may be negative, or having a causal effect. So this type of hypothesis explains the happenings of phenomena, like families with higher income spends more for recreation, foreign goods are perceived by Indian consumers to be better quality than domestic goods. So what we have observed, that there are certain relationship which is linked with that. So if you talk about this particular explanatory hypothesis, we must devise a set of experimental conditions under which something specific will occur if the hypothesis is correct, but it will not occur if the hypothesis is incorrect. So in that case, what happened, the null hypothesis you have taken become rejected, and then you have no option but to accept the alternate hypothesis. So therefore our test must meet two exacting criteria. It must predict what will happen if explanation is correct. It must predict what will not happen if the explanation is wrong. So this is the explanatory study, and now the second one is descriptive hypothesis, and this hypothesis describes the cause and effect relationship of a phenomena. Group, like the example, group study helps to achieve high marks in examination, and public enterprise are more amenable for centralized planning. So what we observe that this descriptive hypothesis model is there, and proposition that states the existence, size, form or distribution of some variable are into picture. And variable can be object, it can be person, organization, situation or event. So it's not like that you can just confine to certain things, but it can be object, person, organization, situation or event. And if you talk about analogical hypothesis, when we formulate a hypothesis on the basis of similarities, analogy, it is called an analogical hypothesis. Like families with higher earning invest more surplus income on long-term investments. So what we have observed that there are certain similarities. If the income is high, if your paying capacity is more, if your spending capacity is more, very easily you can buy some. It's occurred with the elite goods. Or what we observe that there are certain items which are quite expensive in nature, and it scattered the particular segment. So like the expensive cars, the brands like the Mercedes or the BMWs, and which is having a different segment. So, and on the other hand, there are certain gadgets which are going to cater the particular class and creed. Like the Apple phones have got a different segment, whereas the the phone which are in the bracket of 10 to 15,000 rupees are cater the different class and creed. So this is basically a model which is there. And when you talk about the working hypothesis, sometimes certain facts cannot be explained adequately by existing hypothesis, and now no new hypothesis comes up. Thus the investigation is held up. In this situation, a researcher try to formulate a hypothesis which enables continue investigation. So continue, like framed initially, may not be very specific, subject to modification, or when existing data is insufficient. So in that case, you work on the continuing investigation, and you start working, and then in a routine manner you come to the conclusion, or when you start doing the process, because certain changes which are coming up in a very frequent manner, and these how you are going to stop the changes. For that, the working hypothesis will be there. So it could be quite perpetual in nature. It could be quite movement specific, where you can start your hypothesis testing in a routine manner, and it can go up to till the research is on the final end. So this is the model which is there, and there are certain examples which are there, like so now the null and alternative hypothesis is there. If you talk about this particular hypothesis, we have already talked about null hypothesis, which stands with H0, or alternate hypothesis, which stands with H1. So null hypothesis denoted, and the alternate hypothesis denoted as H1 or HA, which we use called as alternate hypothesis. So null hypothesis is the one to be tested, and alternate is everything else. So null hypothesis is general statement that states that there is no relationship between two phenomena under consideration, or that is there no association between two groups. So an alternative hypothesis is a statement that describes that there is a relationship between two selected variables in a study. And when you start with the null hypothesis, then you have certain alternative hypothesis, and finally, if null hypothesis rejected, then alternate hypothesis accepted. So the assumption is beginning with the opposite of what you are testing. So alternate hypothesis is the claim you are testing, and when you talk about the null hypothesis assumes that there is no relationship between two variables, and that controlling one variable has no effect on the other hand. Like the cat show no preference for food based on shape, plant growth is not affected by light color, age has no effect on musical ability. So these are considered to be the null hypothesis. And when you go more into the backdrop of null hypothesis, I think this is a statement that denies the working hypothesis, predicts that there is no relationship between two variables, cannot exist in reality, an assumption that will be maintained by the researcher unless the analysis of data provide significant evidence to prove it, and denoted as HO I have already talked about as 0, or we can say. For example, this is an example which is linked with alternative hypothesis also. In clinical trial, there is no significant difference between two drugs. This is considered to be the null hypothesis. Now, when we move to an alternative hypothesis, the hypothesis to be accepted when null hypothesis is rejected. That is very true, and denoted by H1 or HA we have talked about. And if you see the particular statement which we have used in the null hypothesis, we are creating a replica of that. In clinical trial, there is no significant difference between two drugs. This was null hypothesis, and now alternate hypothesis is in clinical trials, the new drug is better than the current drug. So why we are putting this hypothesis? Because when we start the research, we have certain presumptions, certain assumptions in our mind that we start our journey with this particular framework, with this particular statement. But when it is floated to the respondent, to the group of people, to the masses, and when the masses reciprocates, I think from there the problem comes, because, or the answer comes, because they have a different bent of mind, they have a different flavor, and then the things are there. So anyway, I think statistical hypothesis are the statement derived from a sample. These are qualitative in nature and are numerically measurable. For example, the market share of product X is 70%, the average life of tube light is 2000 hours, etc. So now what we are going to do, how to formulate an effective hypothesis that is there, state the problems that you are trying to solve, make sure that hypothesis clearly defines the topic and focus of the experiment. Try to write the hypothesis as an if then statement, define the variables. I think steps in hypothesis testing is data, state hypothesis, select test statistics, calculate test statistics. Now, if we are going to conclude, HO may be true, do not reject, and this HA is true. So anyway, I think we are going to wind up now, and we have already talked about this particular phenomena. And if you talk about the use of hypothesis, it's a starting point for many research work. It helps in deciding the direction in which to proceed. It helps in selecting and collecting pertinent facts. It is an aid to explanation. It helps in drawing specific conclusions, and then testing theories are there, and it works on the future knowledge. I think we have thrown a light on hypothesis in a very elaborative manner, and starting with the types and what are the concepts which are behind the assumption. So, and the whole research starts with the assumption and then you lead to the final conclusion, which is more realistic in nature. So hypothesis starts with assumption and talks about the realistic approach, and then the model is applied. And I think we could wind up in our forthcoming session. We are going to talk more about the certain phenomena which are going to be useful related to that, and then once we build up the concept, then very easily we can apply the concept in testing the research and other things. Thank you very much.